Today's Europe exists because one empire disappeared almost overnight. Fact 1. If the Soviet Union had never collapsed, the world would probably still be far more clearly divided into two power blocks. Instead of the United States enjoying a long period as the single dominant superpower, Washington would have faced a permanent geopolitical rival with nuclear parity, a huge army, and influence across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and beyond. That would likely mean fewer American-led interventions of the kind seen in the 1990s and early 2000s, but also a more tense and dangerous global balance. Fact 2. Eastern Europe would likely look very different. Countries such as Poland, the Baltic states, Romania and others might never have fully entered Western institutions like NATO and the European Union, or would have done so much later under severe pressure. For millions of people, that could mean less political freedom, slower democratic development, and weaker integration with Western markets. On the other hand, the region may have avoided some of the harsh economic shocks and chaotic privatization that followed the Soviet collapse. Fact 3. Russia itself might actually have been more stable in some ways but less free. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought severe economic collapse, oligarchic privatization, state weakness, and a dramatic fall in living standards for many people during the 1990s. If the Union had survived through reform, that trauma might have been reduced. Pensions, industry, and internal order could have remained more predictable. But the likely price would have been tighter censorship, weaker political pluralism, and a stronger security state across the whole Union. Fact 4. Ukraine would almost certainly not exist in the same way it does today as a fully independent state. It would probably remain one of the most strategically important Soviet republics, central to agriculture, industry, Black Sea access, and military production. That could have prevented the post-Soviet disputes over Crimea and Donbas, because those internal borders would never become international ones. But it would also mean Ukrainians would have far less sovereignty, less control over their own language policy, and far less ability to choose their own future. Fact 5. The global economy would probably be less globalized and more politically divided. A surviving Soviet Union would have kept a large alternative economic sphere, especially in energy, heavy industry, arms trade, and trade relations with allied states. Western companies would have had less access to former Soviet markets, and global supply chains might have developed more slowly. At the same time, some Soviet citizens might have benefited from stronger job guarantees and subsidized essentials. Still, consumer choice, innovation, and personal mobility would likely remain much more limited. Fact 6. The Cold War would not really have ended. It would have evolved. Instead of a dramatic ideological victory for liberal democracy, the world would likely have entered a prolonged period of strategic competition between two systems, a reformed socialist bloc and a capitalist West. This could mean fewer clear victories, but constant rivalry in technology, intelligence, and influence. Conflicts might be less explosive but more persistent, with proxy tensions continuing in regions like the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Fact 7. China's rise might have looked very different. Without the collapse of the Soviet Union, China would not have been the only major communist power navigating global markets. It might have faced competition from a reformed Soviet economic model, or even closer ideological coordination. Alternatively, rivalry between Beijing and Moscow could intensify over leadership of the socialist world. In either case, China's dominance in manufacturing and global trade might have developed more slowly or along a more politically constrained path. Fact 8. Technological development would likely follow a more divided path. Instead of one largely globalized tech ecosystem dominated by Western companies, there might be two parallel digital worlds, one Soviet-influenced, one Western. The internet itself could be more fragmented, with stricter controls on information flows across blocks. This might slow innovation in some areas due to duplication of effort, but could also accelerate breakthroughs in strategic fields like space, military technology, and energy due to intense competition. Fact 9. Space exploration could be far more competitive and possibly more advanced in certain areas. A surviving Soviet Union would continue to invest heavily in space programs to maintain prestige and technological parity with the United States. This rivalry might push both sides toward more ambitious projects, such as permanent lunar bases or earlier missions to Mars. However, cooperation projects like the International Space Station might never happen, replaced instead by competing stations orbiting Earth as symbols of ideological strength. Fact 10. Internal ethnic and political tensions within the Soviet Union would remain a major challenge. The collapse in 1991 was partly driven by nationalist movements in various republics. If the Union had survived, it would likely need constant political reform, decentralization, or force to manage these pressures. Some regions might still attempt independence, leading to periodic internal crises. Stability could be maintained, but often at the cost of political freedoms and with the risk of sudden unrest always beneath the surface. Fact 11. NATO might have remained a far more defensive and cautious alliance rather than expanding eastward as it did after the Soviet collapse. Without the disappearance of its main adversary, NATO countries would likely focus on deterrence rather than enlargement. This could reduce tensions in some areas, but maintain a permanent military standoff across Europe. Countries in Central and Eastern Europe might remain buffer zones rather than fully integrated members, living under constant strategic pressure from both sides. Fact 12. The European Union would likely develop more slowly and with greater internal divisions. The rapid expansion into Eastern Europe after the 1990s was partly made possible by the Soviet collapse. Without it, Western Europe might remain more economically cohesive but politically cautious. The EU could focus more on internal integration rather than enlargement, potentially becoming stronger in some aspects, but less influential globally due to a smaller geographic and demographic reach. Fact 13. Global energy markets would be more tightly controlled and politically influenced. A unified Soviet Union would remain one of the world's largest producers of oil and gas, using energy exports as a major geopolitical tool. Europe in particular might become even more dependent on Soviet energy supplies, limiting its political flexibility. At the same time, stable centralized control over resources could prevent some of the chaotic market fluctuations and oligarchic control that emerged in the post-Soviet space. Fact 14. Military spending worldwide would likely remain significantly higher. Without a clear end to the Cold War, countries would continue investing heavily in defense, nuclear arsenals, and advanced weapons systems. This sustained arms race could slow down investments in social programs and infrastructure in many countries. However, it might also accelerate technological innovation in areas like aerospace, cybersecurity, and engineering, as military research often drives civilian breakthroughs. Fact 15. Cultural exchange between East and West would be more limited and carefully controlled. Travel, media, and academic cooperation would likely face more restrictions, especially within the Soviet sphere. Western culture might still influence Soviet citizens through indirect channels, but far less openly than after the collapse. At the same time, a distinct Soviet cultural identity could remain stronger, with its own film industry, literature, and scientific community developing in parallel, rather than merging into a globalized cultural space. Fact 16. The internet as we know it today would likely be more fragmented and politically controlled. Instead of a largely open global network dominated by Western platforms, a surviving Soviet Union would probably maintain its own tightly regulated digital ecosystem. Information flow between blocks could be restricted, monitored, or filtered. This might reduce the spread of misinformation in some areas due to stricter control, but it would also significantly limit freedom of expression, access to global knowledge, and cross-border communication for millions of people. Fact 17. Scientific research could become more competitive but less collaborative. During the Cold War, scientific progress was often driven by rivalry rather than cooperation. If the Soviet Union had continued, joint international projects in medicine, climate science, and technology might be far more limited. This could slow global responses to shared challenges like pandemics or environmental crises. However, intense competition might also push both sides to achieve faster breakthroughs in strategic fields such as nuclear energy, materials science, and artificial intelligence. Fact 18. Migration patterns would be far more restricted. The collapse of the Soviet Union allowed millions of people to travel, work, and settle abroad more freely. Without that shift, strict border controls would likely remain in place across much of the Soviet sphere. This could preserve internal labor stability and prevent brain drain, but it would also limit personal freedom, economic opportunity, and cultural exchange. entire generations might grow up with far fewer chances to study, work, or live outside their home republics. Fact 19. The global perception of democracy would likely be less dominant. After the Soviet collapse, liberal democracy spread widely as the perceived winning system. Without that moment, alternative political models, particularly centralized or state-led systems, might retain greater legitimacy worldwide. Some countries could align more closely with a reformed Soviet model, balancing state control with limited market reforms. This would create a more ideologically diverse global landscape, but also one where democratic norms are less universally promoted. Fact 20. Large-scale international organizations might be less unified and effective. Institutions like the United Nations would continue to operate, but major global decisions could be slowed by constant disagreement between competing blocs. Cooperation on issues like climate change, global security, and economic regulation would face more obstacles. While this could prevent any single power from dominating global governance, it would also make coordinated responses to global crises slower, more complex, and often less effective overall. Fact 21. The political map of Central Asia would likely remain more stable but less independent. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and others would continue as Soviet republics rather than fully sovereign states. This could mean stronger economic integration, shared infrastructure, and coordinated resource management. However, it would also limit national decision-making and political autonomy. Local elites might have less power, and cultural identities could be shaped more heavily by centralized policies from Moscow rather than independent national development. Fact 22. The global arms trade would remain more polarized. A continuing Soviet Union would still supply weapons, training, and military support to allied states, maintaining influence in regions such as the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia. This could prolong certain regional conflicts or shift their dynamics as opposing sides receive backing from rival superpowers. While this balance might prevent any one side from dominating globally, it would also sustain long-term instability in areas already prone to geopolitical tension. Fact 23. Economic reforms inside the Soviet Union would be unavoidable but uncertain. To survive long-term, the system would likely need to adopt some market mechanisms, similar to reforms seen in China. This could gradually improve efficiency, increase consumer goods availability, and raise living standards. However, such reforms would also risk internal inequality and corruption. Balancing centralized control with market forces would be a constant challenge, and mismanagement could still lead to periodic economic crises within the system. Fact 24. Environmental policies might develop differently, with mixed consequences. A centralized Soviet system could implement large-scale environmental programs more quickly due to top-down decision-making. This might help in areas like energy transition or conservation if prioritized. However, historically weak transparency and accountability could also lead to continued environmental damage, especially in industrial regions. Without strong public oversight or independent media, environmental problems might be addressed more slowly or hidden from the broader population. Fact 25. The cultural and informational divide between East and West would likely persist across generations. Instead of a globally shared media environment, people would grow up consuming largely separate narratives about history, politics, and society. This could reinforce mutual misunderstanding and suspicion between blocs. While each side might develop strong internal cultural cohesion, the lack of open exchange could make cooperation more difficult and increase the risk of miscalculation during periods of political or military tension. Fact 26. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, would likely remain within the Soviet system, significantly altering their political and economic trajectories. Instead of becoming highly digitized, Western-oriented economies, they might develop more slowly under centralized planning. While this could provide stability in employment and social systems, it would likely limit innovation, foreign investment, and political freedom. Their strong national identities would persist, but under tighter control, potentially leading to ongoing tension between local populations and central authorities. Fact 27. Global media and entertainment industries would be less unified and more politically segmented. Hollywood would still dominate in the West, but a parallel Soviet media system would continue producing its own films, television, and cultural narratives. Western entertainment might be restricted or heavily filtered in Soviet territories. This would create two largely separate cultural spheres, limiting shared global experiences. As a result, global pop culture phenomena would be less universal, and cultural influence would remain a key tool of ideological competition. Fact 28. The development of global financial institutions would likely be more constrained. Organizations like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank expanded their influence significantly after the Soviet collapse. Without that shift, their reach into Eastern Europe and Central Asia would be limited. A parallel Soviet-led financial structure might exist, offering alternative systems of loans, trade agreements, and economic coordination. This would reduce Western financial dominance but also create inefficiencies and fragmentation in the global economic system. Fact 20. 9. Nuclear deterrence would remain the central pillar of global security. The presence of two equally powerful nuclear blocs would continue to discourage direct large-scale war between major powers. This balance could maintain a certain level of global stability, as neither side would risk total destruction. However, the constant presence of nuclear tension would also increase the risk of accidents, miscalculations, or escalation during crises. Humanity would continue living under a persistent shadow of potential catastrophic conflict. Fact 30. Education systems across the Soviet Union would likely remain highly standardized and focused on science, engineering, and ideological training. This could produce strong outcomes in technical fields, maintaining a highly skilled workforce in areas like mathematics, physics, and engineering. However, humanities and social sciences might remain more restricted, shaped by state narratives. While this system could ensure consistency and discipline, it would limit academic freedom, critical thinking diversity, and exposure to alternative perspectives. Fact 31. Long-term global power balance would likely remain multipolar rather than dominated by a single superpower. The continued existence of the Soviet Union would prevent the emergence of a unipolar world led by the United States. Instead, global influence would be shared among several major actors, including the Soviet Union, the United States, and a rising China. This could create a more balanced but also more complex international system, where cooperation is harder to achieve and geopolitical competition remains a constant feature. One collapse changed everything. Without it, the world stays permanently divided,